Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sosotris, and this week I'm continuing my Lit 101 series with a special two-part Christmas episode, and we're going to be looking at that enduring Christmas classic, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Now, if you've never heard of this, I won't fault you for it. It's not a super common thing. It was made into a movie recently starring Dev Patel, and I have not seen that movie yet, but I've heard it's fantastic, very artsy and trippy and kind of weird. But Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a Middle English epic poem, and it's short, so you can read it pretty fast, that is a lot of fun, and I think more people need to talk about it because there's just elements in it that they're still fun and they're still enjoyable today. So I'm going to be going through, there's 4 books in this poem, and each book is like a few pages long, so it really isn't that long. So I'm going to be going over the first 2 parts this week, and then next week I'm going to be going over the last 2 parts, and we will be able to go through this whole thing. I'm going to be just kind of looking at the basics, more as like an introduction to this, with a few of the major themes sketched out, just, you know, to give everyone kind of a run through so they can say that they've read it and they've kind of discussed it. But it's a great poem and I love it so much. There's many different translations of it because it was written in a weird dialect of Middle English. Middle English is what you'd see with like Chaucer, so it's like 1300s, 1400s ish. Middle English is one of those ones that when you see it written, you can kind of read it, but the pronunciation is completely different because there was this thing that happened in the English language called the Great Vowel Shift, where all the vowels kind of adjusted, kind of became more closer to what they are in like early modern English, which is what you see in like Shakespeare, which is like 1500s. And Middle English is also one of those ones that it's different depending on where you are, because English hadn't really been like standardized in terms of spelling yet. And so different people wrote in basically the way that they spoke. And so the way it was written sort of reflected the dialect and the accent of the people speaking it. And so this is one where you really do have to translate it. And we're going to talk about the language a little bit later, but there's multiple translations available. This one is my favorite. It's by Burton Raffel. It's a pretty easy one to get. It's not a huge, complicated, expensive book. But I love this translation. It's really immediate, it's really visceral, it's really fun. There are a bunch of others. The other one that I have is Tolkien's translation, J.R.R. Tolkien of Lord of the Rings fame. He did one, and his is good. It's very poetic, it's very epic, it's very kind of true to the sort of classic feel of it, but it can be a bit stuffy at times, and I'm going to be talking about the differences in translation a little bit later as well. But primarily, I'm going to be using this one. There are other translations available for free online if you want to read it. You can read the original Middle English if you're really brave. That one is on the Gutenberg Project, Project Gutenberg, and there are a couple other fully translated versions available. There's a great prose translation that was put out by York University or University of York, one of those, and I put a link to that on my page if you're curious. There's also some folks online that are doing their own translations of it. There's one poet who's part of it's like the alliterative revival project or something like that, and he's like partway through it. He's still working on it, but he posts his translation for free for everyone to read, and it's really, really cool. So, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, it's fantastic. Let's dig into it. So, the first thing to know about this is that we have no clue what the name of the poet is. If anyone is talking about them, it was probably a man, but we just refer to them as the Gawain poet. And I should give a little weird aside here, because when I first studied this, it was in college, and my instructor was Australian, and she pronounced his name Gawain, and I always sort of thought that that was sort of the correct pronunciation. I thought it was like an older one, and it might be-ish, but other people have called it Sir Gawain. It's genuinely referred to as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but if every now and then I accidentally say Gawain, it's because that that pronunciation is just in my brain, and we're gonna go with it. So we don't really know when it was written, but it's kind of the second half of the 14th century. The poet did write a couple other poems, and I think the Tolkien edition that I have does contain those other poems as well. And he just has a really fun style. Now, the dialect that I mentioned before, it's called a West Midlands dialect. And when you see it written, and I'll include an example of what it looks like. When you see it written, it's really difficult to read. English changed quite a bit through the years. Old English is what you see in Beowulf, and that's very much a Germanic language. You can sort of kind of read it, but it looks sort of like a mashup between like Danish and German with a bit of weird stuff thrown in there. And Middle English is where you can see it and read it, but when you hear it spoken, it sounds different. Now, Chaucer is another one that was writing around this time, and Chaucer is a little easier to read. If you see Chaucer written down, it's gonna look still a little obscure, but you can still kind of get a sense of it. Now, Chaucer also sounds very different. So when you see it written, you're like, okay, I can kind of see that. There's lots of extra E's and A's and stuff. But when you hear it spoken, the pronunciation is very, very different. This is also where you get a lot of weird words that today look strange. And we're like, why is it spelt like that? It's because of English. It just does that. So words like knife, we say the word knife, K-N-I-F-E. In Chaucer's time, it would have been pronounced knife. So you would have pronounced the K and the E at the end. And so Chaucer is a little easier to read. His was sort of the standard London dialect, and it was sort of the popular, most people in that area read it, and so that's kind of why Chaucer became more popular than this guy whose name we don't know. I think Tolkien explains the difference between Chaucer and the Gawain poet really well. He says, whereas Chaucer has never become a closed book and has continued to be read with pleasure since the 15th century, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Pearl, one of his other poems, are practically unintelligible to modern readers. So you can read it, but you kind of have to do a lot of work, and you miss a lot of the rhythm and flow of it. So this is one where it is usually better to read it in translation, just because it's a great story and we want as many people as possible to remember this story and to remember this poet. I don't know, I feel like this has a very different style from Chaucer. Chaucer was very bawdy and ironic and poked fun at everything, whereas this guy is much more in tune with sort of French romances and Irish and Celtic myth. He's also quite religious. Religion is going to be a big thing in this, you'll see. So this poem is written in a style that's called alliterative verse, in that it has there's a rhyme scheme to it, but there's also lots of intentional alliteration throughout the poem. And you hear that the most when you hear it spoken in the original dialect. Now, I can't read the original one. I can read Chaucer kind of, and I know how Chaucer's pronounced, but this one is a little bit different. You do see alliteration used in other epic poetry. You see it in the Odyssey, you see it in Beowulf, but in this one, it's very deliberate. It's not sort of occasional flourishes used for effect. In this one, it's sort of the alliteration is the main focus. This poem also uses a technique called a bob and wheel, which, that sounds kind of weird. What that is at the end of a stanza, and the stanzas are kind of any number of lines long, however long it needs to be, each stanza ends with this thing called a bob and wheel. And what it is, and I'll see if I can show you here, you can see the shape of the poem here. And the bob, there we go, is this short line here. Whoops, right here. Is this short line here. And then the wheel is this rhyming section right after. And, oh, I'm throwing things. So what that does is it sort of gives punctuation to the end of a section. So the end of a stanza, you get this sort of short line, and then you have this kind of rhyming section that sort of ends with this da-da-da-da-da, and there's this alliteration throughout, and so it kind of gives it a fun bounce and rhythm to it. Beowulf is a great poem, but it doesn't have sort of bounce to it. Beowulf has sort of got this this heroic thrust to it, where it sort of catapults you forward at all times, and there's moments of alliteration for effect here and there, but it's mostly just meant to be sort of you're careening forward. It's action, it's everything. And there is action in this one, but the style of it with this sort of alliteration, I don't know, it gives it sort of a lyrical, musical quality that I really like. All right, so I've talked a lot about everything else about the poem, but what is the poem actually about? So this is an Arthurian story. It's set during Christmas, actually 2 Christmases, and it tells the story of sort of honor and valor and consequences, and his sense of doing the right thing and staying to his words, the morality of being a knight of the round table. So it's really, really cool, and I love it so much. We're going to go into more in depth, but that's sort of an overall run through of what it is. If you haven't read it and want to before we get to the discussion of the specifics, go and read it. You can read the first 2 sections really quickly. This edition is pretty small. The whole poem is, I know there's a cat here. So this is the whole thing, and this is part 1 and 2. So it's really short, and it's all poetry, so you can get through it pretty fast. So if you want to read it now, come back and watch the rest of the video. Yes, I know, meow. Now, this story is not based on a previous story. A lot of epic poetry is either sort of a written down version of like an oral tradition, or it's a retelling of a story. When you get something like Ovid's Metamorphoses, those are Roman retellings of Greek myths. This isn't a retelling of an older story. There is no sort of ancient legend of Sir Gawain. But what it does is it uses elements from other folk tales and from other romantic traditions, especially in France and Wales. And it sort of synthesizes a lot of different story elements into this. So the beheading game, where like you cut off my head and then a year and a day I come back, you do see that in other stories. I think there's a big famous Irish epic story that does feature that concept. So this isn't necessarily a remake of anything, but it is sort of a synthesis of a lot of different elements from different folk tales and from different romantic epic stories. So I wanted to talk about the translation because this is something that you really do need to read in translation, but the translation you choose affects sort of how you kind of vibe with it, depending on what you like. So there's lots of different options. I'm going to show you 2 versions, this one and Tolkien's version, and then kind of put them side by side so you can see the differences in the translation. I really like this one, and I'm going to be focusing mainly on this one, but I did refer to Tolkien's translation whenever there's something that's sort of unclear in this translation. Tolkien's version is different enough that you can kind of get different details. And you'll notice that the 2 translations sometimes will, like one will leave out an entire word in order to preserve sort of the poetic flow of what it's doing. And so the 2 translations will seem quite different, but I'll show you what they both look like so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So I'm going to start off with an excerpt from Tolkien's translation. This is the first lines. When the siege and the assault had ceased at Troy, and the fortress fell in flame to firebrands and ashes, the traitor who the contrivance of treason there fashioned was tried for his treachery, the most true upon earth. It was Aeneas the noble and his renowned kindred, who then laid under them lands, and lords became of well nigh all the wealth in the Western Isles. So that's Tolkien, and it sounds like Tolkien. He did a really gorgeous job. And this is Raffles' translation. Once the siege and assault had done for Troy, and the city was smashed, burned to ashes, the traitor whose tricks had taken Troy for the Greeks, Aeneas the noble, was exiled for Achilles' death, for concealing his killer, and he and his tribe made themselves lords of the Western Islands, rulers of provinces, and rich. That's what the 2 translations look like, and you can hear the alliteration in each of them. They each use it in different ways, but they do keep that sort of alliterative tradition alive. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a decently in-depth summary of the first book, and then there's a couple things that we'll discuss about it. So this is sort of a breathless run through, and I've got my notes here because there's a lot of it. Here we go. The opening connects England to the tradition of great epics from Greece and Rome, drawing a line of epic succession from Achilles and Aeneas to Romulus and then to King Arthur. Romulus is one of the founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus. So we get to the action. So it's Christmas time in Camelot. It's a 15-day celebration where everyone is celebrating and drinking, and they're not just celebrating sort of the season, but they're also celebrating sort of their own good fortune and their nobility and their prosperity and everything. It's sort of just, we're the Knights of the Round Table, and if you want, you could even put in that scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail where the Knights of the Round Table are all dancing on the tables and singing, because it's kind of that. So this 15-day celebration includes Christmas, but it also stretches to New Year's. So when the poem opens, it's New Year's Eve, but they're still celebrating sort of Christmas. It's sort of this extended Christmas thing. Everyone is exchanging presents at this time. Arthur's having a great time. He's nobly awaiting to be served until everyone else had been served first, because he's the king. And he also is waiting for sort of something epic to happen. It could either be a battle, a performance, a tale told of something great, but he's sort of being like, I'm going to wait for everyone else to be served, and I want something really amazing to happen, and then once that happens, then I can start eating, kind of thing. And so at this point, suddenly, this green man shows up, and he's tall, and what's important is that this isn't some, vagabond ruffian. This guy is supposed to be, incredibly handsome. His clothing is very rich. He's riding a horse, and the horse is sort of attired richly as well. But his skin is green, his hair is green, and all of his clothes are green, carrying a big axe, and he's also carrying a branch of holly. It ties in with the season, and it also shows that he's not a threat. The axe, he isn't holding the axe is sort of strapped to his back, but he's holding a branch of holly to kind of show that he's unarmed, he means well, he's here for no violent reason. He approaches King Arthur, who welcomes the man. He offers him hospitality. The man refuses to stay, but he says that he heard of Arthur's nobility and bravery, and he wanted to see if it's true. So he comes offering a challenge, a game, he calls it, wherein anyone who wants can take a swing at the green man with his own axe, and he won't fight back, he won't run away, and all he asks that is that a year and a day later, he gets a chance to take a swing at the man in turn, who has to kind of come to him. Everyone in the room is sort of shocked and silent. Arthur sort of waits for someone to take up the challenge, but no one does. And so he starts to volunteer, but then Sir Gawain interrupts and says, no, I'll do it. I'll volunteer as tribute. He says that he's sort of the weakest. He's not as established as some of the other knights. He's going to sacrifice himself for the good of everyone else. So the green man accepts the challenge, and he's gracious and kind to Gawain, gives him the axe and says, great, this is wonderful, you can do this. I'll sit here, I'll bend my neck, and you can do whatever you want to me. And so Gawain neatly beheads the green man. He does it sort of aggressively, and so his knife or his axe sort of goes through his neck and into the stones below. This is one of the best decapitations in literature because it's a pretty lengthy description, and there's lots of blood, and his head sort of goes rolling away, and the knights all start kicking it around like a football, and they think it's hilariously funny because this man just got beheaded, and they're like, haha. But then the green man sort of casually stands up, headless, and he goes over and picks up his head by the hair, gets back on his horse, and the mouth of the beheaded head sort of speaks and says, this is wonderful. Now that you've done that, in a year and a day, you need to come find me at the Green Chapel, and I will do the same to you. So, no hard feelings. See ya. So he leaves Gawain a little bit stunned. At this point, Arthur turns to Guinevere, the queen, and says that this is a totally normal thing that happens at Christmas, nothing to be concerned about. He sort of talks to her as if she's concerned, but the poet doesn't actually say that she's concerned at all. So it sounds like Arthur is sort of doing this to let everyone else know, like, everything's fine, I'm sure there's nothing to worry about, go back to enjoying yourself. But he frames it in that he's telling her not to worry so that, it doesn't seem like he's afraid or anything. And so this section ends with Gawain sort of being a bit sort of perplexed and wondering what's happening and what it could mean for him in the future, because he thought that he had gotten himself out of this challenge by beheading the knight, but he's fine. And so now Gawain, in a year and a day, the same thing is going to have to happen to him. And that's how it ends. It's a great cliffhanger. So there's a few themes that we see in this first section. The first is religion. The Gawain poet is quite religious, and so Sir Gawain is also very pious. He uses lots of religious iconography in this, and it's done very earnestly. If Chaucer had used sort of religious stuff, he was sort of poking fun at the establishment. Dante does the same thing in the Divine Comedy. He's sort of a little more ironic about it, but in this one he's very sort of earnest in his depiction of religious piety. And so Gawain is a very religious Christian person, and he wants to be sort of the best person that he can be while following all the sort of tenets that are expected of him. This poet really believes in the power of like religious oaths, and so there's this kind of concept of like your word is your bond. And so when the Green Man came in and offered the challenge, it isn't just a matter of, okay, I'll do it. Gawain actually swears an oath to do it. He says, I will do this, and I promise that in a year and a day I will come find you so you can return the favor if that is possible. And so he takes his religious oath very seriously, and this is going to be really important later on. Another theme to talk about is hospitality, and you see this a lot if you talk about Greek mythology. A lot of times there's sort of this hospitality rule where you don't take advantage of someone who's under your roof. So if someone comes to stay with you, you offer them hospitality and kindness, and you give them everything that you can. And in Greek mythology, it's sort of explained because you never know if a random traveler is going to be one of the gods in disguise, so you have to be kind to everyone. In this one, it's not quite that, but there's maybe this insinuation that any person could be an angel in disguise, and so you have to be kind to them. But there's still this concept of hospitality and being welcoming and kind to everyone. And so when this man shows up, King Arthur welcomes him in, he offers him hospitality, he says everything we have is yours, and what can we do for you, kind of thing. And so it isn't just a matter of how can I help you, it's he immediately offers him access to the food and lodging, everything that he has to offer. These hospitality rules are also important, and these will play in a future part of this poem. Another thing that we see in here is sort of gender roles. This is a very man-heavy poem. There are some important women, though. In this section, we meet Guinevere, the queen. In Arthurian legend, Guinevere is the one who is married to Arthur, but she has an affair with Lancelot, and that sort of is what tears down the whole like Knights of the Round Table and everything, the court of Camelot. But at this point, she's fine. And it's really interesting to see how she's depicted, because she's very much sort of an ornament. And that's important too, because later on we'll meet another woman who's very different and more fun, and you kind of get that contrast between those two characters. Another thing to look at is the way King Arthur is portrayed in this section. He's sort of described as being boyish and boisterous and fun, and he's not sort of this grim, serious ruler. He's just like one of the guys. He's got this kind of Tony Stark sort of vibe. Everyone sort of looks up to him, everyone respects him, but he's just having a great time, but he's also a virtuous, kind character as well. But he's sort of got a lot more personality. Gawain is much more sort of grim and serious, but he's sort of young and naive still, so that kind of makes sense. So that's something to be aware of as well, the contrast between Arthur and Gawain, because Arthur is sort of the ideal that Gawain is sort of hoping to embody, but he's still a little unsure at this point in his life. So we're going to move on to book 2 now, and I'm going to go through the summary, and then there's a few talking points, and then that will be it for this video. All right, so book 2, a year passes. We don't spend much time in that year, so we go back to New Year's Eve, a year later. The reality of what Gawain must do sort of settles on his shoulders, and so he's like, I need to go now. I need to do my duty. I swore to do this, so I have to go find the Green Chapel and let the Green Man behead me. He stays with Arthur's court until All Saints' Day, so about November 1st. And everyone is sad to see him go. They don't want him to leave so soon. They know that he's probably going to his death, and they don't really want that to happen, but he's determined to hold up his end of the bargain. So he gears up and heads out on his journey to find the Green Chapel. He doesn't know where it is, but he's giving himself enough time to find it. So this is November 1st-ish. I said it was New Year's Day, but that's wrong. It was November 1st, and he is going to meet the Green Knight at the Green Chapel on New Year's Day. So he has about a month to find the Green Chapel. There's a lengthy description of his rich armor and a description of the device on his shield. Now this is important too. His shield has a 5-pointed star on it, and it's explained that this star is sort of a symbol of virtue and piety. It's a representative of the 5 wounds that Christ had on the cross, and the inside of his shield has a picture of the Virgin Mary, and so she's sort of a reminder of him, of his virtue. So again, very religious. We have an idea that sort of Gawain's outward appearance reflects his piety. So he travels the land, he's asking where the Green Chapel might be, and the poet does this hysterical thing where he's like, and along the way, he had sort of various adventures, and he fought, like, dragons and ogres and satyrs and trolls and wolves and boars and everything, but that's not important. And I'm like, no, wait, that is important. Like, I really wish he'd written a sequel, or like an in-between-quel, that was sort of all of his adventures fighting these monsters while he's searching for the Green Chapel. But it's sort of like, and that happened, whatever, moving on. And we're like, wait, you'll come back. I love that. We don't hear a lot of details about what happened during these adventures, but we do hear that his faith strengthened him and sort of gave him superhuman courage to survive and destroy all of these various fantasy monsters. Winter settles in, and he nearly dies of exposure on a few times, and so he prays to the Virgin Mary for a place to stay, because winter is really becoming rough, and he doesn't think he can keep wandering around in the snow. And so that's when he immediately finds a church. And he also realizes that it's Christmas Day. So he's been traveling for about 2 months at this point. And it's Christmas Day, and so he really, really wants to attend a Christmas Mass, because that's sort of one of the most important periods of the year. He wants to acknowledge sort of the birth of Christ and what that means to him. So the Lord of the Castle welcomes him in. Again, you get that hospitality as well. There's a Christmas feast going on at that time. He welcomes him. He offers him a place at his table. There's a bunch of other people there as well, including the Lord's wife. The Lord's wife is awesome. So there's this whole section which talks about the wife's beauty and her elegance. It talks about her ladies in waiting. She has sort of a bunch of people attending her. The king is very gracious, and he offers Gawain sort of permission to talk to his wife. He sort of gives him consent to do that. And, everyone is great. Gawain is sort of smitten by her beauty, but of course he's very respectful and kind, because that's who he is. Everyone in the castle has a feast that goes on for multiple days until they get to the point where Gawain explains that he has 3 days to find the Green Chapel. So we're now, right, it's like the 28th at this point, December 28th. And so he has 3 days to find the Green Chapel. And the Lord says, oh, actually the Green Chapel's like right up the hill. You can get there in half a day. You can stay here until then. You don't need to go out wandering in the snow. And so then the Lord of the Castle makes a bargain with Gawain. And he says, we're going to do this game. There's another game where he says, I'm going to go out hunting, and you stay here at the castle with my wife, and at the end of the day, I will give you everything that I've hunted, so every animal that I've caught, and you give me everything that you won while staying in my castle. So it's sort of done non-maliciously. It's sort of like, this is going to be a fun thing. It's great. But you can tell there's sort of this concept of trust in here. This is sort of a test, because if Gawain steals anything, or if he does anything to his wife, he's going to have to either give it to him, give it to the Lord when he comes back, or if he does anything with the wife, he's expected to sort of do that to the Lord when he comes back. Yes, it is what you're thinking. He's like, all right, and he agrees to this because it sounds sort of nonsensical at this point. He's like, that's fine. I won't take anything from your house. That's okay. And the Lord says, great, love that. So tomorrow we're going to do this. And then that's where that stanza ends. And so there's this sort of, again, there's this test of his character where everything that he wins in the Lord's house, he has to trade to the Lord for everything that the Lord wins while out hunting. And so in a perfect world where nothing happens, basically the Lord's just going to come home and give him everything that he caught, and then Gawain will have nothing to give to him. And that's sort of expected. But we're going to go into the next section next week and see how that plays out. The Lord and his wife are hilarious, and I love them so much. And if this was written today, they would be like this like swinging kinky couple who just likes messing around with random people who come through their house. But this is not what this poet intended, so it's not quite that. But you know, you are meant to kind of have that in the back of your mind, because these people, you know, even though this is a very kind of serious, pious, religious poem, the people of this day and age were just as bawdy and fun-loving as we are today. So I'm sure his audience would have appreciated that element. So, okay, looking at sort of the analysis of this, there's a common theme in many medieval romances where the knight would come across sort of a beautiful woman who was either a slave of or a wife to sort of an awful man who was sort of an ogre or just a brutish guy who was really coarse and dangerous. And there was sort of this thing where he would either trick the man and sneak the wife away, or he would defeat the husband and then sort of win the wife as a prize for himself. And it was always kind of assumed that that was sort of a good thing, because she was obviously not happy with this boorish, brute of a man, and she would be happier married to a noble knight. And so there's this, women as a prize to be won, which isn't great. In medieval romances, you did see that theme. And so this poem is very much playing on people's expectations of that. So it's sort of this inversion of that expectation where, you don't want him to really steal the wife away, because this guy is a really good guy, and his wife sort of is in a good place. She's happy and well taken care of. And so the challenge that the Lord offers him is sort of a different kind of, it's like the opposite of that older sort of story trope, where we don't want him to win the wife. We want him to sort of reject her advances. We want him to be virtuous and respectful. And when the Lord comes back to give him the things that he's caught, we want him to have nothing to give the Lord, because he's not taken advantage of his wife and he's been very respectful. But there's this tension all the time. His chastity with the allure of playing into that sort of romantic trope. And when I say romance, I mean like medieval romance, which is sort of action, adventure, virtue, and, fair heart never won fair lady kind of thing. Not romance as in like modern day romance novels, which is about a relationship. So this is different. This is a romance in terms of like, an adventure. And so ultimately, the challenge to Gawain is that the wife is an object to be sort of praised but not touched, and he has to resist the temptation. So next week we're going to talk about Gawain's fate, and we're going to talk about the outcome of the challenge at the castle. So with that said, I don't have anything else to talk about today. We will continue this at a later time, and then we'll wrap up the whole poem next week. So I look forward to seeing you again. In the meantime, have a wonderful Christmas season, and if you have other holidays that you celebrate, happy holidays, and I will see you next week, and in the meantime, happy reading. Bye!